state in Tennessee in 1925, science teacher John Scopes was convicted of violating a Tennessee law prohibiting the teaching of evolution. 2 years later, his conviction was overturned based on a technicality. But laws banning the teaching of evolution and upholding creationism remained on the books until the U.S. Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional in 1968.
Today, evolution is widely accepted among scientists and educators. The biblical story of a six-day creation and a literal Adam and Eve is generally regarded as a religious myth, which may or may not be read as having deeper theological significance. Nevertheless, debates over creation and evolution haven't gone away. In recent years, legislators in states including Tennessee, Oklahoma, North Dakota, and West Virginia have tried to get the teaching of creationism back into the schools.
But what is the Catholic Church's view on this debate? Does the Catholic Church teach the existence of a literal Adam and Eve? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of the podcast.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well now that I've had my second cup of coffee. How are you?
Well, our audience missed my kitten jumping up onto the bookshelf behind me and then knocking like 5 books and a bunch of little knickknacks off onto the floor. So that's, I don't know, I feel like that's a metaphor for my day or something. That's about how I'm doing.
It could be a metaphor for the relation between different created beings in the world and the fact that we believe in an overarching order, but this order isn't always reflected in the way we behave and the way our animals behave either.
There's Rebecca making a theological point about everyday occurrence. It's pretty true to form.
So this whole debate is really fascinating to me because most Catholics I speak to, including you all, have grown up with an understanding that evolution is accepted, evolution is taught in schools, but I had a lot of experience with Christians, not just evangelicals, but also Catholics who are still kind of pushing back against evolution and trying to push for a belief in a literal Adam and Eve and a six-day creation. And the university I used to teach at just hosted a debate, both sides just last year. So it's still something that's on people's minds.
It's so wild to me because I remember being, I don't know, pretty young, maybe 7 or 8, and going to my mom because at the time I was like, I'm going to read the Bible. I grew up in a family of evangelicals. But I was like, I'm going to read the Bible. And then I read the story of Adam and Eve, and I went to my mom and I was like, did God really make the world in 6 days? And my mom was like, it's a metaphor. Belief in a literal 6-day creation and a literal interpretation of the Genesis story in general is not often associated with Catholic Christianity. Your experiences aside, I know there are exceptions to every rule. The Catholic Church itself, though, has never condemned evolutionary theory.
Yeah, and this opens up so many fascinating questions because if Catholics can believe that human beings evolved, what does that mean about our creation story, especially these characters of Adam and Eve in Genesis? Can the Catholic teaching on original sin hold up if we don't believe a literal first man and woman were tempted to eat forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden?
It gets extra confusing because if you read the scripture, there are actually 2 different creation stories in Genesis. And often when we talk about them or interpret them, we combine those 2 stories into one. But the first story in Genesis 1 focuses on the creation of the universe. It starts with the heavens and the earth, it goes into the animals, and then it ends with the creation of human beings, and God rests on the seventh day. The second story really zeroes in on the creation of human beings. First, God fashions Adam out of the clay of the earth, brings him the animals to name, and then finally, when he is still lonely, creates a companion for him, Eve, out of his rib.
Yeah, and I think we really look at this story kind of through the lens of all of these layers of interpretation and the little Bible stories that we read. So we forget about what's actually going on there. There's actually 2 trees in the story. There's the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. The serpent tempts Eve to eat the fruit from the tree of good and evil. Then she gives it to Adam. They both realize they are naked. They become afraid. God realizes that now they ate from the first tree. They might know to eat the fruit from the other special tree in the garden, the tree of life, and live forever. So God casts them out of the garden. The Christian interpretation of this is that the serpent is Satan, though the story never says this, and that this is where original sin comes from. Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden as punishment for their sin, a sin they can never make up to God, thereby introducing the need for Jesus Christ.
For the purpose of this episode, I think the main question we're asking is this a myth? Is this story completely mythological? And if so, what does that mean about our beliefs around original sin? Today's guest is going to talk to us about what science and the church have to say on the question of whether Adam and Eve were real. I'm Emily Santa, one of your hosts for the Glad You Asked podcast.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, the people who make this podcast possible.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. Were Adam and Eve real?
Today we're going to talk to John Farrell, a writer and producer working in Boston. He's the author of The Day Without Yesterday, Lemaitre, Einstein, and the Birth of Modern Cosmology, and The Clock and the Camshaft, and other medieval inventions we still can't live without.
He has contributed to U.S. Catholic and many other publications, including Commonweal, Cosmos Magazine, New Scientist, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Boston Globe, Salon, Forbes, and The Tablet of London.
Hi, John. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad you asked.
Glad to be here.
So I think the last time you and I discussed science together, it was at Notre Dame back in 2018 with Brother
Yeah.
Guy. And what I most vividly remember about that conversation was I was kind of added to the panel in the last minute, and I was like, say something about science. And I think I talked a lot about parasitic wasps on
Yes.
tomato hornworms. Yes.
And worms, yes.
I was not the best contributor to that discussion.
So, to start us off, I was hoping you could just give us some context about what the Bible says about Adam and Eve and how early Christians kind of interpreted the first couple chapters of Genesis.
Sure. I think in the first couple of centuries of the church, in the evolving church, the story was understood pretty much in terms of the wages of sin is death. Adam and Eve sinned. They brought death into the world. They were exiled. Um, and that sort of, if you can call it that, the tradition for a couple of centuries, because of course, during this time, the church hadn't even quite decided what the canonical gospels, what everything was going to become. So there was some diversity of opinion about it, but not a lot of speculation. I think Irenaeus believed that one, he thought children were stillborn innocent in spite of the first sin, and that we inherit sin from Adam and Eve more by bad example than anything kind of fundamental to our nature. That began to change, I think, with Tertullian in the late second century, early third century. He got onto this idea. Well, I think it was actually generally accepted, the belief that the soul is also generated during sexual intercourse between, husband and wife. God didn't directly create it. And he used that idea to argue that, well, then we can see how something like original sin was inherited, literally propagated from Adam down to all people. And St. Augustine really picked that up and embellished it and kind of codified it. And then from there, I think some of the councils between then and the Council of Trent it was really established as doctrine. That's sort of in a nutshell how that came about.
So, over time, as more scientific discussions and discoveries were coming along, especially in the Renaissance and Enlightenment era, were there any kind of challenges to dominant beliefs? Did the official interpretations change over time?
I don't think so. I think percolating underneath, especially after the Protestant Reformation and the expansion of the study of geology, it was really geology first that started questioning, how old is the Earth? It certainly seems like it must be much older than the Book of Genesis suggests, and this was even before Darwin. So I think nothing officially for the Church, really. I think until Darwin himself did it become a kind of a topic of concern at the Vatican.
So, moving away from church teaching for a second, what do we know about the origins of humanity?
Um, I think the best way to put it is Chris Stringer, who's a British paleontologist, and he wrote a book about this, and the title was Lone Survivors. We're sort of like the last surviving species of a Homo, and we're still here where there were, it seems, increasingly evident that there were lots of different populations of related humans who've all gone extinct. The Neanderthals are the ones who are most prominently in the press because when it was discovered that we actually have genes that we inherited from intermixing, interbreeding with them 40, 50, 60,000 years ago. So our history, our origin is almost like a mosaic rather than a kind of discrete, sudden happening or emergence into the natural world. We sort of emerged slowly over millennia, and we're the ones who are still here.
So, did the scientific discoveries about evolution disprove the story of Genesis? Did people understand this as potentially disproving the story of Genesis? And what were some of the significant debates or developments as the Catholics were grappling with this question?
I think, yeah, I think because I think it's probably harder for us to understand now. But I think most people, believe the creation story literally, that God literally fashioned us, and that the creation was very discrete. So as it became more and more evident that the world was a lot older, evolution certainly challenged the idea that creation was so specific. It was gradual. And starting almost right after Darwin in the 19th century, you had some Catholic scholars, some were scientists, some were theologians, who began investigating how can we reconcile evolution in a broad sense with Christianity. And without being too public about it, because of what happened with Galileo, the church sort of clamped down on that kind of discussion. There were three or four, there's a whole book about this I should recommend. There were three or four priests who published books that then had to be retracted. They were kind of quietly told, you either have to repudiate this or pull it from circulation or issue some sort of public apology. And, I didn't really mean what I said. And this was at a very broad level. It wasn't getting into original sin. It wasn't getting into any kind of specific church doctrines that would be challenged by human evolution. It was just a kind of broad idea that, look, the world, has evolved over time, over a great length of time, and obviously, natural selection and random processes are part of that. So that was a big no-no, even at that level of kind of popular accounting. So you do have kind of once Darwin's book was published and official, and I think there were people in the Vatican who wanted to put the book on the index and were sort of kind of quietly dissuaded from that. But the tension really starts, I think, in the mid 19th century.
I think it was Pope Pius XII who he allowed for evolution, but insisted that the human soul was created specially and kind of apart. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about about those ideas and what he suggested, as well as kind of how that started to shape Catholic discussions on Adam and Eve.
Yes, I think Humani Generis is the encyclical he wrote in 1950 to address that and some other issues. And he very kind of grudgingly conceded that yes, science can investigate the origins of the human species from the physical perspective, but we have to maintain that the human spirit is directly created by God for each and every one of us. And in a way, this sort of created more problems than it solved. Because now you had this idea that God's creating each soul is like a separate event from just the natural process of birth of every human being. And it sort of hung there as a problem, I think, that later popes, Pope John Paul, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis, didn't really address but talked around. I think Pope John Paul gets a lot of credit for being very kind of positive about evolution as a science, and particularly respecting the autonomy of the sciences, which doesn't come across in Pope Pius the XII's encyclical. Um, so you have this issue now of a kind of a cleavage between body and spirit that I don't think it was intended, but sort of came about. So now you're faced with this question of, okay, so does God pipette a soul into each, fetus as it's conceived? It seems really kind of strange, rather than a kind of more cohesive understanding of, like Aristotle, anima forma corporis, the soul is the form of the body. It seems much more kind of cohesive. So that was, I think, has become much more of the challenge. In fact, I would say it's the main challenge with Catholicism, Catholic doctrine, and evolution. And that includes, it kind of wraps into it, the doctrine of original sin, because clearly humans have descended from a smaller population, but we are not descended from a single mating pair. In fact, nothing in nature. There's no species that was ever started by a single mating pair. There have been bottlenecks that have been brought species close to extinction and they bounced back from, but it's never been just, mom and pop.
So today, the church accepts evolution as a scientific fact, right? Um, so how do we deal with the Genesis story then? Is there still an option to read it literally? Are we supposed to look at it metaphorically? Are there some parts we have to believe and other parts that we can kind of interpret as we see fit?
I think in the Catechism, again, kind of general terms, says the Bible uses figurative language, and then kind of proceeds to talk about Adam and Eve again, like they're real people, and something actually happened. And I think, to your point, it's sort of a mix. You can look at the story and say this is an allegory, but we are required to believe that there was a sin committed by somebody, and this has propagated down to us. So yes, you can. I think Catholics can have some leeway with how they understand the story. They don't have to believe it literally, but they do need to believe that at the beginning of time, um, uh, our first parents committed a sin, and we've inherited it.
So, if you were going to maybe write a reflection or a homily on Genesis 1, kind of what would you include in it? How would you reinterpret the scripture knowing everything we know now about evolution?
I think, fortunately for me, some theologians and scientists, Catholic scientists, have been thinking about it. And actually, there are several ways you can sort of save the appearances. In other words, there's no threat to the doctrine of original sin if you rethink it in certain terms. And for example, the late Herbert McCabe, the Dominican, talked about the fall as not being due to any specific commission of a sin, but he said it was more like a fall up rather than a fall down. And we understand our sinfulness and our tendency to commit evil as being due to the fact that at a certain point in our development, our evolutionary development, our ingenuity began to run away from our moral instinct. And he uses the analogy of, the normal revulsion anyone would have to, like, for example, strangling their own child or a 12-year-old child. And he said, compare that now with handing someone a high-powered rifle and saying, very far away, you can't see it unless you look through the glass. Just pull the trigger, and you don't actually see that you blew a child's brains out, say in Iraq or whatever. So he sees the evil as something that was probably inevitable given the way we evolved. And you can still talk about it as a fallen nature, and it is very much written into our genes and propagated through the entire species. So that's one way. And kind of going off that, I think it was Darrell Domning, who was a Catholic paleontologist. He co-wrote a book a few years back called Original Selfishness, How to Re-Envision Original Sin. And kind of in the same fashion, he said, we have to go way past Adam and Eve to the very beginning of life. Because, written into evolution, of course, is survival. And to survive, you often have to be selfish. And he says, if you locate, what we call original sin back at the beginning of time, again, there's no problem accepting the doctrine that this is written into our genes, our sinfulness. The cost of that, I think some critics would say, is that, yeah, but now you're suggesting that God made the world in such a way that evil was there from the beginning. And, that's a problem, I suppose, that also has to be addressed separately. I always just think, well, the Bible says God created the world and it's good. It didn't say it's perfect. So I don't really see that as a problem, but I think there are theologians who would.
So, for people who like a literal reading of the Bible, and I know many of them, is it possible, realistically, to be consistent, to believe in a real historical Adam and Eve, and also accept what science tells us about evolution?
Yes, you have to do some serious cartwheels, mental gymnastics to do that. But to give you one example, I think it was at the couple of years ago at the annual meeting of either the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars or the Society of Catholic Scientists, and it was shortly after COVID. So the people were dialing in by Zoom, or a few people were there. But there was a panel discussion about, okay, how do we reconcile what we know to be true by science and the doctrine of original sin and our understanding of Adam and Eve. And one suggestion was, okay, obviously humanity evolved according to the principles we already understand. And then at some point, God pre-selected, Adam and Eve, took them out of this population, put them into paradise. They sinned, and he threw them back out into the general population, where over time, their genealogy sort of outpopulated everybody else's. And what was really funny to me was I remember a young man, very dapper, conservative, dressed up in a suit, was sitting in the audience. He sort of raised his hand and said, "This whole thing seems silly." And I just thought, yeah, it works, but it's kind of like a bit of a clunker in terms of how to reconcile. But to answer your question, yeah, you can do it. Um, Sort of in a science. I mean, it might be something Roger Zelazny would have written as a kind of a whacked out 1960s science fiction story.
So given all of these mental gymnastics that people are doing to kind of make these two things reconcile, right? Like why is it so important that Adam and Eve be real historical people, right? Why does this matter so much?
Um, I guess my only answer is I think it matters to people at a pastoral level. They like to think of, we love myths. We read myths and even the classical myths that have nothing to do with religion. There's a human face, a human name on people like that. So I think it's been ingrained in our Christian tradition for so long. It would be hard to just, throw it away. And in fact, I remember talking to a Dominican priest who was a scientist about this, and he said, I'm not going to tell my grandmother, the whole thing doesn't make any sense and it's just made up. She's in her 80s. I don't want to rock the boat. So we kind of, let people think or believe that way. And again, I think if you look at the story allegorically, it doesn't mean, the characters don't appeal to you or have some kind of an impact on you the way a literary figure would. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why it persists.
So, we always close these conversations by asking, what's the one thing you'd like our listeners to take away from this discussion?
I would say is read more of the science because one, it's fascinating, and two, I think in the bigger picture, it does all integrate. I think into the main principles of our faith, of the gospel, and of the church. I think Pope Benedict, not a lot of people know this. 50 years ago, he wrote an essay precisely to kind of resolve the problem that Pius the 12th raised, which is okay, in light of evolution, what does it mean to say we're specially created? And his answer is really inspiring. He sort of channels Teilhard and channels Martin Buber, I and thou, and comes up with an answer that's basically relational. It wasn't about, an act of creation like an event. It's more at some point, human beings realized they could address their creator and did, began talking to him, began praying. And he said, in that balance, that's, where you find the specialness of our creation. And I thought that was a really interesting essay. Uh, I wish he had made it into an encyclical when he was Pope.
So John, that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you again so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
So, based on this discussion, it sounds like the answer to the question is it depends on what you mean by real.
To help us discuss, our producer Sarah is going to jump on. Hi, Sarah.
Hey guys.
Yeah. So, what did you think about that interview?
Yeah, I mean, John like really laid everything out really well, especially the different theological interpretations of Genesis. I'm just like caught up in how there is still, it seems, some sort of flexibility within the church for believing a literal interpretation of the story. I just find it frustrating because I think there's so much richness in understanding like the nuanced theological interpretation of it. And it feels really limiting when we can't encourage people to move past that literal reading. I'm curious about like what is appropriate, the level of tolerance for a literal interpretation of the story among Catholics.
I guess I was surprised that throughout history, as there's this acceptance of evolutionary theory and the science behind it, there was still kind of this like twisting in knots to be able to keep the same theology based on this story that people are going to admit is a metaphor, is a myth. To me, I think kind of changing or expanding how we view the story of Adam and Eve, the creation story, creation in general, it opens up so many possibilities for thinking about sin in more profound ways. Thinking about like sin as a structure instead of as this personal debt that Adam took on that humanity can never repay. And I just wanted the church as a whole to go there, and then everything John would say would be like, "Well, and then they, like, did this other thing so that they could keep this, like, other old understanding of what sin is." So I guess it was never as challenging, evolution was never as challenging as I kind of wanted it to be. And maybe it was to some people and that we it was just beyond the scope of the interview, but that was just something that continued to surprise me as we kept talking.
Now, I think what surprised me was kind of the opposite because, given my background, I was always surrounded by people who were kind of pushing creationism. I just talked to someone the other day whose son got in trouble at a Catholic university for arguing pro evolution. And I'm like, wow, the church was actually a lot more open to this from the start. And so that leaves me frustrated because we had all of this space for exploring the theological implications of the truth and also for unpacking the theological implications of the story. And I feel like we're kind of losing both of those when we try to hold on to a literalist interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets into the next question of like, is there anything that you wished that we had been able to go into deeper? Because it does seem like like all of this does have theological implications that we just kind of didn't have the time to get into.
Yeah, we didn't get into it, but I would like to know more about the sort of like gendered blame that's in the story and how Eve seems to bear so much of like the responsibility in the fall. I'm sure you both have a lot of thoughts about that. But yeah, I would like to know more about how that plays into ongoing gender dynamics in the church and what the literal reading does to support that.
Yeah, I kept thinking about that, to my point about, people continuing to tie themselves in knots. I was like, we have this whole way to say that sin is not just one woman's fault, and yet we're really wedded to that idea. We're still gonna stay with everything is Eve's fault, even though she may not actually have existed.
Yeah, I think it really highlights just how much the way we interpret things, and I appreciate the fact that the Catholic Church has left us with this kind of scope. But the choices we make when it comes to interpretation really show a lot about where we are morally as a culture. And it seems like the decision to continue to read it literally so we can blame women, it's harmful.
I wanna say that one of the best homilies I've ever heard was by a woman, a community organizer on the Genesis story and creation, told from Eve's point of view, and it was so good and so meaningful. Just about the experience of just from her perspective about what would inspire her to eat the fruit, her interactions with the serpent, what it was like to be a mother and to give birth. It reminds you really don't see your perspective as a woman reflected all that often from the pulpit, and how meaningful and profound and it can be to have that experience and to see yourself reflected in biblical interpretation.
Yeah, and that I think one of the things I would have liked to have discussed more was just this whole phenomenon of interpreting sin in this way. I know many of my fellow progressive Christians have rejected the idea of original sin because they think it's negative. I think it's actually a really helpful metaphor for talking about the world we live in. But I wish we had a way of talking about it that doesn't, as you said, Emily, make it all about this personal act of sin and looking more at this kind of this disorder in the relationship between different living beings in creation, even the way we treat creation itself.
And John kind of got there, right? He talked a little bit about different understandings of sin. But I think there is something that's really meaningful in being able to understand that sin is baked into human society on a structural level that we could maybe start talking about if we started kind of taking this evolutionary view more seriously.
Yeah, another thing I'd like to, and I could probably get really nerdy and boring about this, the whole phenomenon of the body soul union and this idea that, that the soul is like dropped into the fetus at a certain point and that we've really kind of constructed, some Catholics have constructed an extremely problematic view of the human person in order to hold on to this literalist view of the origin of humanity.
Well, I would encourage both of you to read the book Big Mama Makes the World, which is by Helen Oxenberry, who's like a famous children's book author and illustrator. It's about God is a mother and already has the little baby with her, and she creates the world. And it parallels the Genesis story, but as a different interpretation. And I think it shows how you can kind of use myths to make meaning in different ways. Yeah, so the last question, if you were going to write a sermon, a homily about Adam and Eve and original sin and evolution, what would the takeaway be?
I think an important takeaway that I wouldn't necessarily think a lot of people would need reminders of, but maybe they do, is that just faith and reason aren't opposites and they can work together even when they seem to be in tension and can lead you to more truths about your faith.
Yeah, I think on a similar note, I would encourage people to go back to texts instead of following popular interpretations. Go back to the original sources and seek understanding about where they came from. Look at the different stories that they developed from, because that's our tradition. And when we're afraid of it, when we're afraid to dig into it and find the truth and ask questions, we're really denying ourselves. We're denying ourselves the richness of our tradition.
Yeah, I think I would talk about myth and scripture and how we can find even more meaning and truth in a story when we don't take it literally.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we'll be discussing whether Jesus was a refugee.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The Claretian Summer Mission is for young men and women ages 18 to 30 who feel called to grow in their relationship with God. Inspired by St. Anthony Mary Claret, this experience will equip you for meaningful service while connecting you with a community of faith-driven young adults. Learn more and apply today at www.myclaret.org/Claretian Summer Mission.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton Weiss, with assistance by James Chung McKenna. We're produced by Sarah Butler Schuler, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.